Welcome to the Essential Southern Podcast, where we explore the rich history, culture, and traditions of the American South.
Welcome back to the Essential Southern Podcast, hosted by the Abbeville Institute. The Abbeville Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to exploring what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. We exist on your generous contributions alone, so if you like this podcast, our website, our conferences, all of our programs, our projects like the 1607 Project, we appreciate your support. Go to www.abbevilleinstitute.org and donate to the organization and keep things like this ongoing and free of charge to the public. All right, well, let's talk about the topic of the day, and that is the South in the Building of the Nation series. And by the way, I'm the host of this podcast, Brian McClanahan. I didn't mention that, but the South in the Building of the Nation series. This is a series of books published in 1909 by many of the leading scholars in the United States who claim the South as their home. They were born in the South, or they had studied the South extensively, but mainly native Southerners. And I want to talk about today the introductory essay to this particular series of books. There's, again, multi-volume. It's a series that's available free of charge online. You should read it. It gets into a number of different parts of Southern history that they make the claim have been generally ignored, or at least misinterpreted or misrepresented. Now, there are critics of this series of books. Again, we're seeing these written in 1909. The authors of these essays were men and women of their times. Many of the statements they would make about race relations in particular would be seen as offensive today. But they were generally to be held, these views on race, by most of the American population in the early 20th century. They wouldn't have seemed to be odd or incompatible with what was being said in the North, for example. The charge of racism or racist attacks on these books is simply to deflect from the meaningful contribution to American history that they in fact make. Now, the primary editor of the series was J.A.C. Chandler. Chandler is known as the father of colonial Williamsburg. He was the president of the College of William and Mary. He actually followed Lyon Gardner Tyler into that position. And he was responsible for essentially getting the money from the Rockefellers to create colonial Williamsburg and what it is today. Now, colonial Williamsburg does not really recognize Chandler much anymore because he doesn't really fit with their current narrative, their current interpretation of things in Virginia or in the past. But Chandler viewed Williamsburg as an expression of the real South. He was a progressive for his time. He wasn't in favor of some of the more virulent policies or abuses of Black Americans, for example, that you would see in the 20th century. And many of the writers held this same stand. They held these same views on the issue of race. He was unapologetically Southern. He was unapologetically interested in the original Constitution. He didn't apologize for the war. He thought Southern leaders were great men. He thought Southern politicians were great men. He was not happy with the fact that the South really hadn't been represented or given proper review by Northern historians up to this point in American history. And that's essentially what led to the creation of these books. Today, you see a narrative where people will say, well, Southerners were trying to rewrite history in the late 19th and early 20th century. They weren't trying to rewrite anything. They were trying to explain their section for people who did not understand it. And I'm going to read sections of this essay, and Chandler, who is a historian, gets into why this series of books had to be written. In some ways, it's the reason why the Abbeville Institute exists. By the early 20th century, Southerners were cognizant of the fact that other people were going to be writing their history, were going to be telling their story, and they wanted to ensure that their voice could be heard in that discussion. We have no problem with this with any other group of people in the world. For example, when Greeks want to write their history, We have no problem with Greeks writing their history, or Romans, Italians, for example, Germans, Brits, people of different races, different nationalities, different religions. We have no problem with those people writing their story. But for Southerners, in the United States in particular, this has become problematic because it's thought that these people just want to lie. Now, some of this comes out of the vitriol of the victory in the North in the 1860s. Southerners cannot be trusted. Southerners, unless they are saying things that Northerners agree with, are simply lying. And so the corrective was many of the histories that were produced in the late 19th and early 20th century that were written by Southern voices and done with an eye to ensure that their story, their narrative of events, would be heard. Probably the next Essential Southern podcast will focus on a chapter in Forrest McDonald's book on the writing of history. It's entitled Recovering the Past. And he gets into this. He says, look, history is a collection of myths and legends. And it's not untrue. In fact, David Blight has gotten a lot of publicity for writing what he calls memory studies, which essentially is history. He's made a whole new subfield of history. He's saying memory studies are a new field of history, and essentially you're studying history. I mean, that's what history is. It's the remembered past. And the fact that people have a memory or a view of the past does not make it incorrect. It makes it their view, their interpretation of events. And we can try to find if the events line up to this, and people's memories can get foggy. But their view of the past isn't necessarily untrue. It's how they view it. And again, MacDonald does a nice job of this, and so does John Lukács, who's wrote a fantastic book on history itself. But I do want to focus on, the essay is too long for me to do in one podcast. So I do want to focus on parts of the essay in explaining why he thought in 1909, why the writers, the editors, thought in 1909 it was essential for the South to have its own history of its own people in its own section. And in this series of essays in each volume, multi-volume work, they're going to cover a variety of topics, from state histories to social history to intellectual history to literature to economics. They do talk about race relations. They talk about slavery. They talk about everything. It is a history of the South. And many of the writers are sympathetic with the different peoples. I mean, for example, in the volume on social and intellectual history, you have a discussion of Southern Jews, Southern Catholics. They talk about these groups of people who lived in the South, who were certainly part of the South. You also have discussions of black Southerners in a variety of topics. And they're not antagonistic, but sympathetic. Now, some of the statements that would be made, again, in the book would reflect the racial attitudes of the period of the time. The people of the time, I should say. And they would not be the same kind of things that would be said today. But the history they offer is pretty good in terms of the evidence they present, the topics that they cover. For example, there is an essay on Southern economics, on black property owners, and the interest of black labor conditions in the South after the war. I mean, that stuff is there. So these are topics that had not been covered very much by people outside of Southerners. And the man who wrote that essay is often considered, again, one of these, he's often dismissed because he's held racial views that, again, they're not in line with modern America. But the evidence he presents, and he's sympathetic. The chapter is not hostile to black Americans at all. It's very sympathetic. The evidence is good. I mean, he presents the material that he has. And so when you have these books that have value, but simply are discarded because somebody doesn't like the tone that's used in some of the presentation of material, the same thing would be said for U.B. Phillips, who wrote fantastic books on Southern plantations and Southern plantation slavery because of the tone of the works, or the Dunning School because of the tone of the works. That shows you the lack of intellect of the people writing the attacks. They simply are writing polemics. So, let me get into parts of this this introduction. In fact, the title of the chapter is The Introductory Outline to the History of the States. Notice the title, again, the long title of the series is The South and the Building of the Nation series. But what they're doing here is saying that each state, the South, can't just be considered to be monolithic. There are differences throughout the South. There are different Souths, and I think that's also important to understand. There is a Southern tradition, but in that tradition, maybe an overarching tradition, but in that tradition, there are different places, different regions, different peoples, different attitudes, different economies. I mean, the South isn't monolithic. Just like the North is not monolithic. I mean, New York is not Massachusetts, for example. It's not monolithic. But oftentimes the South is just the South, this other. And that's an incorrect way of looking at it too. And so there are many different components of the South, but again, we could say there's a general Southern tradition, particularly politically. And I think that's something that is important to understand. But culturally, there are many different Souths. And understanding the different cultures in different places is perfectly fine. I mean, this is where someone like Drew Gilpin Faust would say, well, the only thing that held the South together was slavery. That's not true. And I think that that the editors of this series do a nice job of showing that. So the first subtitle of this chapter is The South Misunderstood. And again, why would Chandler lead off with the South misunderstood? Because it is the most important part of the entire series. Why does the Abbeville Institute exist? Because the South is misunderstood. So let me read this. Some years ago, Dr. Thomas Nelson Page delivered an address on the want of a history of the Southern people. In this address, he said, quote, "There is no true history of the South. In a few years, there will be no South to demand a history. What of our history is known by the world today? What is our position in history? How are we regarded? Nothing or next to nothing is known of our true history by the world at large. By a limited class in New England, there is a vague belief founded on a sentiment that the South was the aristocratic section of this country, and that it stood for its rights even with an indefensible cause. By a somewhat more extended class, its heroism is admired sufficiently to partially condone its heresies. But these are a small part of the public. So in England, there's the aristocratic section, it stood for its rights, even in an indefensible cause, right, for slavery. By a somewhat more extended class, the people of England admire the heroism of the Southern soldier. By the world at large, we are held to have been an ignorant, illiterate, cruel, semi-barbarous section of the American people, sunk in brutality and vice, who have contributed nothing to the advancement of mankind. A race of slave drivers who, to perpetuate human slavery, conspired to destroy the Union and plunged the country into war." Now, to the world at large, you could say go on social media, and when people don't like your position, if you're saying anything positive about the South, that's what you're going to get. Doesn't matter if it's from the United States or somewhere outside of the United States. That's the general position. This is being written in 1909. What's really changed in over 100 years? Nothing. In fact, it might have gotten worse, because I'm not certain if you could say in Great Britain there are people that have the views that Thomas Nelson Page said here of a certain class in Britain. Most would view it the other way. This is the history wars. This is why history matters. On this war, precipitated by ourselves, two salient facts are known. That in it we were whipped, and that we treated our prisoners with barbarity, I should say. Libby Prison and Andersonville have become bywords which fill the world with horror. Why should this be, when the real fact is that Libby was the best lighted and ventilated prison on either side, when the horrors of Andersonville were greatly due to the terrible refusal of the Northern government to exchange prisoners or to send medicines to their sick, when the prisoners there fared as well as our men in the field, and when the treatment of Southern prisoners in Northern prisons was as bad, if not worse, and the rate of mortality was as great there as in ours. So why is it they think these things? We were whipped and that our prisons were terrible. Why do they think that? Well, because they don't get the other side of the story. So South was whipped and they treated their prisoners horribly. That's what you get. They're war criminals. Why don't we have that same perspective on the other side? So Chandler says, much of what Dr. Page has said is correct. No true history of the South has been written. The South has been greatly misrepresented because her history has not been given fully to the world. But the feeling which existed a few years ago with reference to the South is fast disappearing, and the other sections of this country, as well as the world at large, are realizing that the South is not such a section as she has been represented to be. More and more, the historians are studying Southern conditions and learning that the Southern people have figured in more ways than one in the history of America. Slavery was an institution which flourished and grew chiefly in the South, and since the only struggle in America between the states resulted in the extinction of that institution, the first thought in the mind of a Northern man when the South is mentioned is the institution of slavery. But as Southern life and Southern conditions are studied, historians are beginning to associate the South with other events in American history and with institutional development other than slavery. That's 1909. No, so he's being very positive here. Well, we had this negative view. It's all about slavery and then, of course, about terrible prisons. Southerners are barbaric. That's all it is. But he's saying in 1909, people are starting to look at things a little differently. Maybe there's more to this. Maybe there's more to this Southern people. Maybe there's more to the Southern tradition. Maybe these people aren't the demons that we make them out to be. And this is all part of reconciliation. If only we could still have such enlightened and magnanimous people who are willing to look at the South and examine the South without the glasses of radical Republicans blinding them and forcing them into conclusions that simply aren't true. It doesn't mean there aren't thorns in the Southern tradition. You don't bulldoze the rose bush because there are thorns on it. It doesn't mean there aren't negatives in the Southern tradition and Southern history. There are. They exist. But to say then the South has no value, that's the point of this series of books. They're not saying these things don't exist. They're not saying these things weren't bad. They're not saying that these things, we're not happy these things are gone. What they are saying is that the South has roses to offer, and it has offered its best and brightest to the American cause for, at this point, well over a century, and it should be recognized as such. And other historians are starting to do it. He says, much of the investigation in Southern history, which of recent years has been going on, has been made not by Southern writers, but by men of the North, who in many instances have faithfully and consistently tried to be fair, but who, because they have not been reared under Southern conditions, have been biased by the environments of their youth and by their residence without being aware of that fact. Notable among the writers who have given prominence to Southern life and history are Rhodes, Fiske, and Albert Bushnell Hart. The latter two, connected with the great Harvard University, have endeavored to present fairly Southern conditions, but neither has been able to view the life of the South through the same glasses as a Southerner. So, we've got some people that are trying to do some of this work. They're trying to be fair. They're trying to look at the South in a different way and not so biased, critically biased. They're actually trying to show the South and the positives out of it. That's a good development. Why is it any other people, any other place in the world can be viewed that way, but not Southerners? Well, again, it's the war. It's the lingering effect of the war. And why is it you can't say positive things about Southerners on social media without being called all kinds of names? Well, because you have the treasury of counterfeit virtue. It's the righteous cause myth festering like a pustular sore today. You should be able to say these things. The South did offer a lot to America, and that people North and South and West should all be proud of. But the problem is, of course, you've got righteous cause mythologists, and you have this very distorted view of what America is, the proposition nation myth, that's factoring into it. And if you live by that myth, you're never going to think that anything the South offered was true and valuable. You see? That's the real issue. It always will be the issue. So then he has a subsection, Need for a History of the South. He says, the time is therefore ripe for the production of a comprehensive, broad, and scholarly work by Southern writers. The time is right to do this. In 1909, I would say the time would be right to do this in 2024. The problem is, you're not going to find many Southern writers who have academic clout who aren't going to want to be overly critical and negative about the South today. There aren't going to be many people that would be positive about it. Chandler says, such a work must cover much untraveled territory and new sources of material, and necessarily cannot be all-inclusive or entirely accurate, but in its general concept will be true to the South, showing its influence in the building of the nation, with harshness and bitterness eliminated. Could you write such a history today? Absolutely not. Such a work should turn the eyes of Southerners to a more careful study of their own history, and should likewise rectify the misconceptions of many Northerners, placing the South in its true position with reference to the rest of the nation. The need of the presentation of the history of the South is seen on every hand. School children in all parts of the country know of the Mayflower, but few know of the Discovery, the Godspeed, and the Susan Constant. That's very true. He's saying this in 1909. It's only gotten worse by 2024. That's the whole point of the 1607 project. The relative importance of Virginia and Massachusetts in colonial days is rarely fully appreciated, and few will remember that Virginia was a colony of 11 plantations with a representative assembly, making laws for the government of the colony, planning for a college, asserting the rights of British subjects before the Pilgrims had landed at Plymouth. Again, 1607. Few also recall the impetus given by the Virginia colony to colonial enterprise, resulting in the establishment of other American colonies and the development of the English colonial empire. Few really recall the fact that the Pilgrims who sailed in the Mayflower were searching for Virginia, but were unexpectedly driven to the bleak coasts of New England. This is not in any way intended to detract from New England's influence in the development of the nation, but it is the duty of a Southerner as well as the duty of a New Englander to preserve the history of his own particular locality and to give that locality its proper relation to the history of the entire country. So it's not disparaging. I mean, we're not trying to disparage New England here and say these people don't have interest in writing their own history. They do. But on the other hand, we need to ensure that Virginia becomes part of this. And again, because I'm saying this, I want to turn your attention to 1607project.com. Watch the free video we have. It's part of the things we've done as the Institute. We spent a good deal of money on this project and trying to do what this book essentially is saying, and that's reorient our discussion of what America is back to Virginia. Now, we can say there's a New England version of America, too. It's there. I mean, it does exist. Is it correct? No, not necessarily. But we do need to have Virginia as part of this discussion. He says, the local history of New England, as well as its relation to the nation, has been in many ways thoroughly written. The South must do likewise with its history, but to the present time only one phase, that which looked to the disruption of the Union, has been written, and that in voluminous works. So the only thing people think about with the South is 4 years of war, 1861 to 1865. Nobody else has endeavored to do anything with the South in a broader context. What at this point, we're at 300 years of Southern history. Now we're at 400 years of Southern history. Why do we only focus on the 4 years of the war? The whole point of the Institute is to look at the entirety of history. We do talk about the war, without question. It is a momentous event in the history of the United States, the history of the South. But we also talk about Southern history outside of that, because those things are as important, both before and after the war. We like it when our scholars focus on things outside of the history of the war. The war's fine to talk about, but it's not what defines the South. He says, in writing the history of the South, a number of elements must be taken into consideration. First, it is necessary to think of the states in their individual capacity. Yes, Virginia is not Alabama. Alabama is not Texas. Texas is not Missouri. So when you think of the states in their individual capacity, you have these individual histories being written, and the peoples of those places become important. In essence, what you're doing is looking at things from a very bottom-up perspective on America, instead of the top-down, very bottom-up. It's very Southern to do that. Where are you from, not what do you do. Each has, in some ways, a peculiar life and a peculiar development which must be recognized in the portrayal of its life as a whole. A comprehensive and general treatment, therefore, of each state should be made. Moreover, the relation of one Southern state to another, and finally the relation of the Southern states to the federal government, both individually and as units, must come under the eye of the historian. In other words, we believe that there should be a history of the Southern states individually, succeeded by a comprehensive treatment of the political, economic, and social history of the states in their relations to each other and to the nation. In such a history, some states should be considered that were not members of the Southern Confederacy, but which owe their development to the South, such, for instance, as the border states of Maryland, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Missouri. Maryland is essentially Southern, while West Virginia and Kentucky owe their origin to Virginians. This might also be said of Missouri, which owes its growth to Southerners. In such a work, there should also be sketches of the lives and accomplishments of the statesmen who have figured so prominently in the movements that have produced our growth in territory and wealth and have made ours the greatest government on the earth. Notice he's saying this in a comprehensive way. He's saying this as America as a whole, but as a Southerner talking about America as a whole. Southerners were very proud of the United States. They were very proud of America, and very proud of their impact on America, both before and after the war. He's not just talking about 4 years. So I want to skip down to a section that he has. He gets into various different sections about colonies and what Southern people are, and the South and the Revolution. He's going through some general phases. The Union itself, what it meant to the South. I want to get to this section that he calls Southern Statesmen in American History, because this is not something that's lost on people today. In fact, the way they frame it is that the South had this oversized impact on American politics because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Without that, the South would have had nothing. We would have had a northern-dominated United States. So because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, the South had undue influence, undeserved influence. But I do want to point out several of the facts that we've actually said on our introductory phrases, the introductory principles for the Abbeville Institute. So let me get into this. He said, the South furnished to the Union its Washington to be its first president, its Jefferson as the first Secretary of State, its Edmund Randolph as the first Attorney General, its Madison to shape legislation in the first House of Representatives. In a few years after the federal government had been formed, it furnished John Marshall as Chief Justice to so construe the law that the federal government became as strong and binding as if a nation had been created in the beginning. So we've got all these great leaders, statesmen, and did things coming out of the South that are important for the United States. As the country grew, the population of the South did not increase as rapidly as it did in the North. For in 1790, the population of the two sections was nearly equal. But by 1860, the population of the South was 12,103,147, and the rest of the country, 19,340,174. It is thus seen that the great movements of population were to the north and west rather than to the south. The South, however, though its population in 70 years decreased one-half to nearly one-third of the entire population of the country, maintained a greater influence in the affairs of the government in proportion to her population than any other section of the country. Especially to be considered is the fact that when the slave population is subtracted, the North and West always had more than 3 times as large a population of citizens. Bearing this in mind, we may note the following suggestive facts. So, take out the slave population, and we've got these huge numbers, huge numerical advantage for the North, but yet the South still had a large role in the government. And he's going to outline what these things are. Of the 25 occupants of the White House, the South has contributed 10. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, and Johnson, none elected since the War of Secession, and all within the period of 80 years from 1789 to 1869. Southern presidents held the reins of government for nearly 53 years, so none since 1865. You could even, if you wanted to stretch, you could say Lincoln was also from the South. He was born in Kentucky. Of the 26 vice presidents, 7 were from the South: Jefferson, Calhoun, R.M. Johnson, King, Tyler, Breckinridge, and Andrew Johnson. Of 40 secretaries of state, the South furnished 12, as follows: Jefferson, Edmund Randolph, John Marshall, James Madison, Robert Smith, James Monroe, Henry Clay, Edward Livingston, John Forsyth, Abel P. Upshur, John C. Calhoun, and Hugh Les Laguerre. Of the 43 secretaries of war, the South furnished 15, as follows: James McHenry, James Monroe, William H. Crawford, John C. Calhoun, James Barber, John Eaton, Joel Poinsett, John Bell, George Crawford, Charles M. Conrad, Jefferson Davis, John B. Floyd, Joseph Holt, Stephen B. Elkins, and Luke E. Wright. None since 1860 except Elkins and Wright. Of the 37 secretaries of the Navy, there have been 16 from the South. Of the 22 secretaries of the Interior, the South contributed 9. Of the 42 secretaries of the Treasury, 10 were from the South. Of 42 postmasters general, the South has furnished 14. Of the 4 secretaries of Agriculture, there have been from the South 1. Of the 44 attorneys general, the South furnished 18. Of the 8 chief justices of the Supreme Court, the South furnished 3. Of 35 speakers of the House of Representatives, 15 have come from the South. Of 44 ministers to Great Britain, 6 only have hailed from the South, and of 40 ministers to France, as many as 17 were from the South. So you've had all this influence. Now, not a majority, not even half in many cases, but you've had a pretty substantial amount of influence. Notice he qualifies it, though, and says, really not since the war have you seen this. Why? Why the shift? Even today, you look at the major presidential candidates. Is anyone from the South? No one. No one's from the South. We've moved away from that because Southerners are considered, sure bet to vote for the Republicans. So Republicans aren't really concerned about putting a Southerner on a ticket. As I'm recording this, I just saw that Kamala Harris has picked the governor of Minnesota as her running mate, or at least those in power chose the governor of Minnesota as his running mate. And look, there's all kinds of baggage with this guy. But they're not trying to even invite Southerners into this government. Trump did with J.D. Vance. But even Vance was not, he loves Kentucky. So you can say that's a positive for J.D. Vance, but is he from the South? His family is. He grew up in Ohio, but this is a big question with J.D. Vance. But regardless, this is really interesting when you put these numbers out there and you start looking at the influence of the South and the general government and things like that. It's huge, and it was huge. But the story had not been told, according to Chandler and the other writers in this series. That's all I'm going to cover in this particular podcast. There's so much meat in this thing. It's so good. There's a lot of great information to get out of it. Everybody should read it, even if you don't agree with the conclusions that it offers on a variety of different topics. But it would serve to broaden your perspective on the South. And you've got a lot of really good scholars, the leading people in their fields for the time, who are writing in this series of books on the South. It's well worth your time and investment to go do it. I'm just scratching the surface in this podcast. But until next time, good day.